When people ask me what life was really like growing up in 1970s America, I usually smile before I answer, because it's hard to explain a world that no longer exists. A world where childhood felt wide open and fear hadn't yet learned how to follow us everywhere. Before I go any further, let me invite you to slow down with me for a while. If these kinds of memories matter to you, if you miss the feeling of a simpler America or just want to understand it better, take a second to subscribe to this channel. These stories are for those of us who remember and for those who wish they could. Now, let me take you back. I grew up in a time when the day didn't start with a phone buzzing on the nightstand. Because there was no nightstand phone, and if there was a phone in the house, it was bolted to the wall with a long curly cord, and everyone shared it. Mornings began with sunlight through thin curtains, the sound of a parent moving around the kitchen, and the quiet understanding that once breakfast was done, the world outside was ours. No one tracked us with apps. No one asked for our location every 5 minutes. We walked out the front door and disappeared into the neighborhood, and the only rule was simple: be home when the streetlights came on. And somehow, that was enough. I think what surprises people today is not what we had, but what we didn't have. We didn't have constant alerts, emergency headlines, or a steady drip of bad news telling us the world was dangerous. We knew danger existed, of course, but it wasn't injected into our minds every hour of the day. Fear didn't live with us. It visited occasionally, then left. In the 1970s, childhood wasn't supervised minute by minute. It was trusted. Parents trusted the world more, or maybe they trusted us more. Either way, that trust shaped us. We learned how to solve problems because no adult was always nearby. We learned how to talk to people because screens weren't an option. If you wanted to know something, you asked. If you were bored, you invented something to do. If you got into trouble, you figured out how to get out of it or how to face the consequences. Looking back now, from a world filled with passwords, notifications, and constant worry, it feels almost unreal. Today, children grow up watched, recorded, measured, and warned at every turn. Back then, we grew up free. Not reckless, not careless, just free in a quiet, everyday way that didn't make headlines but made memories. As I tell this story, I'm not here to say the past was perfect. It wasn't, but it had something precious we didn't realize we were holding at the time. And as the years go by, that something feels more valuable than ever. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a personal memory. It's my life. And as we move forward together, I want you to imagine yourself there with me, walking those sidewalks, hearing those sounds, feeling that sense of safety that came from knowing the world was big, but your place in it felt secure. This is what life was like in 1970s America, at least the way I remember it. And once you step into this memory, you may realize why so many of us still carry it close to our hearts. One of the clearest memories I have from the 1970s is how the neighborhood itself felt like an extension of our home. The houses weren't just buildings lined up along a street. They were markers in a shared landscape we all understood. Mrs. Henderson's place was where you could always get a glass of water on a hot day. The Miller house had the best tree for climbing, even though we pretended not to notice the no trespassing sign nailed to the fence. Every driveway, every yard, every cracked sidewalk told a story, and we knew them all by heart. We moved through that space with a kind of quiet confidence that's hard to explain today. We weren't fearless because we were brave. We were fearless because the world hadn't taught us to be afraid yet. Parents didn't hover. They didn't walk us everywhere or watch us from a distance. Once we were outside, we belonged to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood, in a way, looked after us. If you fell off your bike, someone's mother would come running with a wet paper towel and a band-aid. If you stayed out a little too late, word somehow traveled faster than you did, and your parents already knew by the time you got home. There was a network of eyes, but it didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like community. Summer days stretched on forever back then. Without phones or schedules pulling us in different directions, time moved at a slower, gentler pace. We rode our bikes until our legs burned, then rode some more just to see how far we could go before the houses started to look unfamiliar. That was our version of adventure. No GPS, no maps, just curiosity and the confidence that we'd find our way back. And we always did. When I think about childhood today, I notice how carefully planned everything seems. Playdates arranged days in advance, locations shared, check-ins required. In the 1970s, play happened organically. You stepped outside, listened for familiar voices, and followed the sound of laughter. Games weren't organized. They evolved. One minute you were throwing a baseball. The next you were inventing rules to a game no one had ever played before, and no one would ever play again the same way. And when arguments happened, as they always do among kids, we handled them ourselves. We learned compromise, forgiveness, and sometimes the hard lesson of walking home alone and thinking about what went wrong. There was something grounding about that. Something that taught us who we were without needing anyone to label it for us. Even the adults seemed less anxious. My parents worried, sure, but not constantly. The news came on once a day, and when it was over, it was over. There was no endless cycle of breaking stories, no notifications dragging fear into the living room at all hours. Danger felt distant, abstract, something that happened somewhere else. Today, it feels like danger is always knocking, always reminding you it exists. Back then, it waited its turn. That difference changes how a child grows up. It changes how you see the world, and how you see yourself in it. As a kid in the 1970s, I felt capable, trusted, known, and even now, decades later, that feeling still lives somewhere inside me, like a quiet echo from a time when the world felt manageable, and childhood felt safe in a way that didn't need explaining. School in the 1970s was another place where that sense of freedom quietly shaped us, even though we didn't recognize it at the time. Walking to school was a daily ritual, not an event that required planning or supervision. Groups of kids formed naturally along the way, picking each other up house by house, talking about nothing and everything all at once. We crossed streets on our own, learned which shortcuts saved time, and figured out how to be responsible without anyone explicitly telling us we were being taught a lesson. By the time we reached the school doors, we already felt a little older, a little more independent, and strangely proud of it. Inside the classroom, things were simpler, but not easier. Teachers expected something from us, and that expectation carried weight. There were no tablets on our desks, no smartboards glowing on the wall, just chalk, notebooks, and the steady sound of a teacher's voice. If you didn't pay attention, you missed something, and that was on you. There was no replay button, no recorded lesson waiting at home. That reality taught us to be present in a way that feels rare now. We learned how to listen, how to sit with boredom, and how to push through it until understanding finally clicked. Recess, though, that was where childhood truly lived. The moment the bell rang, we spilled outside like we'd been holding our breath all morning. No structured activities, no adults organizing every minute, just open space and imagination. We played tag, kickball, dodgeball, or made up games with rules so complicated they only made sense to us. Scraped knees were badges of honor, not emergencies. You wiped the blood on your jeans, waited for it to stop, and went right back to playing. Today, I watch kids at schoolyards and see how different it is. Helmets, rules, forms, permission slips. Back then, the only permission we needed was the sound of that bell. Even discipline was different. If you got in trouble, it was usually handled right there, face to face. A stern look, a talk after class, sometimes a note sent home that made your stomach drop. There was accountability, but it didn't follow you forever. Mistakes were moments, not permanent records. You learned, you moved on. After school, the day felt like it truly belonged to us. We dropped our books at home and disappeared again until dinner. Homework existed, but it didn't dominate the afternoon. There was still time to climb trees, explore empty lots, or just lie in the grass watching clouds drift by, imagining shapes and stories that felt important then and silly now, yet somehow meaningful. In today's world, childhood often feels compressed, scheduled, and monitored. Back then, it unfolded naturally, one unhurried afternoon at a time. We weren't rushing toward the future. We were fully inside the present. And that presence, that unspoken permission to simply be a kid, is something I believe shaped an entire generation. It taught us patience, resilience, and a quiet confidence that didn't need validation from a screen. Looking back, I realized school wasn't just about reading and math. It was about learning how to exist in the world without constant guidance, trusting that we could figure things out as we went along. And somehow, most of the time, we did. Evenings in the 1970s had a rhythm that feels almost foreign now. Like a slow song everyone in the house somehow knew by heart. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the yard, the day gently told us it was time to come home. You didn't need a text message or a reminder. You could hear it in the quieting of the street, see it in the way parents began calling names from front porches. When the streetlights flickered on, that was the final signal. Childhood adventures paused, not because we wanted them to, but because tomorrow promised more of the same. Inside the house, dinner wasn't rushed. It wasn't eaten in front of a screen or between activities. We sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation that wandered from school to neighbors to nothing in particular. There was a sense that this time mattered, even if no one said it out loud. Television came later, and when it did, it was an event. One screen, a handful of channels. If your favorite show was on, you planned around it. If you missed it, you missed it. That was it. And strangely enough, that made it special. Families gathered in the living room, the glow of the TV reflecting off familiar faces. We laughed at the same jokes, felt the same suspense, and talked about it the next day at school, as if we'd all shared the same dream. Today, entertainment is endless and isolated. Back then, it was limited and shared. Even commercials felt different. They weren't something to skip or avoid. They became part of the experience. Catchy jingles and simple promises that stuck in your head long after the show ended. After TV, the evening slowed again. Maybe someone read the newspaper. Maybe a parent flipped through a record collection, letting music fill the room instead of noise. The phone might ring once or twice, and whoever answered would talk loud enough for half the house to hear, because privacy wasn't a priority. It was connection. Bedtime came without much resistance. The day had been full, physically and mentally. We were tired in a good way. Lying in bed, there was time to think. No glowing screen inches from your face. No endless scrolling. Just thoughts, memories of the day, and plans for tomorrow. Sometimes fear crept in, but it was small and fleeting. The dark wasn't filled with headlines or notifications. It was just the dark, familiar and harmless. I compare that to nights now, when the world seems to follow us into bed through our devices, whispering worries we didn't ask for. In the 1970s, nighttime was a boundary, a pause, a reset. Sleep came easier because the mind had space to rest. Looking back, I realize how much that quiet shaped us. It taught us how to be alone with our thoughts, without being overwhelmed by them. It gave our days a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something today often feels blurred together. Those evenings weren't dramatic or extraordinary, but that's exactly why they mattered. They grounded us. They reminded us that life didn't need constant stimulation to feel full. Sometimes, all it needed was a shared meal, a familiar show, and the comfort of knowing tomorrow would look a lot like today. And that was more than enough. Weekends in the 1970s carried a different kind of magic. A quiet promise that life was about to slow down just enough for you to notice it. There was no rush to fill every hour with activities, no pressure to make the time productive. Saturday mornings began early, not because an alarm demanded it, but because our bodies were used to waking up with the sun. Cartoons on television felt like a small reward, something just for us before the rest of the house fully woke up. We sat cross-legged on the floor, cereal bowls in our laps, completely absorbed, unaware that this simple routine would one day become a memory people longed to recreate. After that, the day unfolded naturally. Sometimes there were chores, sure, but they were straightforward and finite. Mowing the lawn, washing the car, raking leaves depending on the season. You did them, you finished them, and you were free again. There was satisfaction in that. Tasks had clear beginnings and endings. Today, so much of life feels ongoing, unfinished, always asking for more attention. Back then, responsibility didn't follow you around in your pocket. It stayed where it belonged. Errands often turned into small adventures. A trip to the hardware store or the grocery store wasn't something to get through as fast as possible. It was a chance to tag along, to listen to adults talk, to absorb the rhythms of everyday life. You learned how to stand in line, how to count change, how to make small talk with people you didn't know. These were quiet lessons, never announced, but they stuck. Afternoons usually meant being outside again. Friends appeared without warning, knocking on the door or calling from the sidewalk. Plans were loose. You might end up playing baseball in an empty lot, riding bikes to the edge of town, or just sitting somewhere talking about the future as if it was something distant and abstract. There was no urgency to grow up. Adulthood felt far away, and no one was pushing us toward it faster. Even Sundays had their own tone. Stores closed early. The pace of the world noticeably slowed. Families visited relatives, shared meals, or simply stayed home together. There was a collective understanding that not every day needed to be exciting. Some days were meant to be quiet. That kind of shared stillness is rare now. Today, weekends often feel like a blur of obligations, notifications, and attempts to recover from the week, while already worrying about the next one. In the 1970s, weekends actually rested. They gave you space to breathe, to reset, to feel time rather than chase it. As a kid, I didn't know that was a gift. I just knew that when Monday came, I felt ready. Ready to walk back to school, ready to step back into that familiar rhythm. Looking back now, I see how those unstructured days taught us balance. They showed us that life didn't have to be constantly filled to be meaningful. Sometimes, meaning came from doing very little at all. Together, without an audience, without a record, just living in a moment that felt ordinary then, but extraordinary now. One thing people often forget about the 1970s is how deeply music wove itself into our everyday lives. Not as background noise, but as something you felt with your whole body. Music wasn't everywhere all the time like it is now. You had to choose it. You had to earn it, in a way. You saved allowance money to buy a record, held it carefully on the way home, and placed it gently on the turntable like it was something fragile and important. And it was. When the needle dropped, the room changed. Time slowed. Everyone listened. Albums weren't skipped through. You heard every song in the order the artist intended, even the ones you didn't like at first, because sometimes those became your favorites later. Music taught us patience and attention without us realizing it. Radio mattered too. DJs felt like friends, familiar voices that kept you company while you did homework or cleaned your room. You waited for your favorite song to come on, finger hovering over the record button on a cassette deck, hoping you'd catch it before the DJ started talking again. There was disappointment when you missed it, and a strange joy when you didn't. That effort made the music stick. Songs weren't just sounds, they were moments. I can still hear certain tracks and be instantly transported to a summer night. Windows open, warm air drifting in, the world feeling big and full of possibility. Today, music is endless and instant. Every song ever made is a tap away, and somehow that abundance has taken away a little of the magic. Back then, a song could define a year, a season, a feeling. It became part of who you were. Music also connected us to each other. You shared records with friends, argued about bands, listened together in silence. Concerts weren't content for a phone screen. They were experiences you carried home in your chest, your ears ringing, your voice gone, heart full. Beyond music, pop culture in general felt slower, more communal. Movies came to town and stayed for weeks. You didn't binge-watch shows, you waited for them. Anticipation was part of the enjoyment. Today, entertainment is constant, personalized, and isolated. In the 1970s, it was shared and limited, and because of that, it mattered more. Even advertisements reflected a different tone. They spoke to families, not individuals. They promised togetherness, not perfection. Looking back now, I realize how much those cultural rhythms shaped our emotional lives. They gave us common reference points, shared memories that instantly connected strangers. You could mention a song, a show, a movie, and watch someone's face light up with recognition. That kind of cultural glue feels thinner today, spread across countless niches and screens. In the 1970s, culture brought us together because we were all looking at the same things, listening to the same sounds, waiting for the same moments. And in that shared waiting, we learned how to feel deeply, collectively, without needing to announce it to the world. Fear is something I think about a lot when I compare my childhood to the world kids grow up in now. Not because fear didn't exist in the 1970s, but because it didn't dominate our lives. We weren't raised under a constant warning system. Our parents didn't sit us down every day to remind us of everything that could go wrong. Instead, they taught us basic common sense and trusted us to use it. Don't talk to strangers. Look both ways before crossing the street. Be home on time. That was about it. The rest of life was left open for us to explore. The news played a role in that too. It came on at a specific time, lasted a specific length, and then it ended. You didn't carry it around with you. You didn't wake up to it, check it during lunch, and fall asleep to it. Because of that, fear didn't have a chance to grow roots. It stayed contained. Today, fear feels ambient, like background noise you can't turn off. It seeps into conversations, decisions, even moments that should feel safe. Back then, safety wasn't something we talked about constantly. It was something we assumed, something that lived quietly in the background of everyday life. Parents worried, yes, but they didn't let that worry shape every rule, every choice. They understood something we seem to have forgotten, that growing up requires a certain amount of risk, not reckless danger, but small, manageable risks that teach you how to navigate the world. When you fell off your bike, you learned how to get back up. When you got lost, you learned how to ask for directions. Those experiences built confidence. Today, many of those lessons are filtered through screens, simulations, and warnings. And while the intentions are good, something gets lost along the way. I see children now who are constantly connected, but rarely free, constantly informed, but deeply anxious. In the 1970s, we were often uninformed, and that ignorance gave us peace. We weren't burdened with the weight of the world before we were ready to carry it. Our fears were personal and immediate, not global and abstract. As a child, my biggest worries were things like failing a test or getting in trouble for coming home late. I wasn't thinking about disasters, crimes, or crises happening far away. That mental space allowed joy to exist without competition. Play wasn't interrupted by anxiety. Laughter wasn't shadowed by dread. Looking back, I realize how formative that was. It shaped how I approach life even now. I don't panic easily. I trust my instincts. I believe most people mean well. Those beliefs were built in a time when the world felt safer because we weren't constantly told it was dangerous. That doesn't mean the world truly was safer. It means our relationship with fear was healthier. And that difference, I think, is one of the most profound shifts between then and now. Childhood in the 1970s wasn't protected by constant supervision or technology. It was protected by trust, by community, and by a shared understanding that fear should inform life, not control it. Another thing that feels almost unbelievable now is how we handled being bored in the 1970s. Boredom wasn't treated like an emergency. No one rushed to fix it for us. If you said you were bored, the response was usually a shrug or a suggestion that quickly turned the problem back on you. Then go find something to do. And so we did. Boredom became a doorway, not a wall. It pushed us into creativity, into exploration, into moments that couldn't have been planned. We built forts out of scrap wood and old sheets. We turned sticks into swords, rocks into treasures, empty fields into entire worlds. None of it needed approval or documentation. There was no audience. That freedom to create, without being seen, shaped how we thought. It taught us to be comfortable alone, to let our minds wander, to sit with our thoughts until something interesting emerged. Today, boredom is filled instantly, almost automatically, by a screen. There's no space left for that quiet spark. In the 1970s, imagination filled the gaps. We told stories to each other, exaggerated our experiences, invented versions of ourselves that felt just as real as the truth. Those stories bonded us. They gave us a sense of identity that came from within, not from likes or comments. Even waiting was different. Waiting in line, waiting for a ride, waiting for dinner. You didn't distract yourself. You observed. You listened. You daydreamed. That practice of waiting built patience, something that feels in short supply now. Today, even a few seconds of waiting feels uncomfortable, like something has gone wrong. Back then, it was simply part of life. Technology didn't fill every silence. Silence was allowed to exist. And in that silence, you learned things about yourself. You noticed your emotions. You processed experiences. You grew quietly, without realizing it. I think about how rare that kind of inner growth has become. Constant stimulation leaves little room for reflection. In the 1970s, reflection happened naturally. You walked, you sat, you stared out a window. Those moments weren't wasted. They were essential. They gave our lives depth. They made experiences linger. When something exciting happened, it echoed longer because it wasn't immediately replaced by the next thing. Today, moments are quickly buried under new content. Back then, they stayed with us. Boredom also taught us resilience. When there was nothing to do, you learned to endure discomfort without panic. You learned that the feeling would pass. That lesson carries into adulthood. It teaches you how to handle stillness, how to face difficult moments without immediately reaching for distraction. Looking back, I see boredom as one of the greatest gifts of my childhood, even though I would never have called it that at the time. It gave me a mind that knows how to wander and return, how to rest and re-engage. In a world now filled with endless noise, that ability feels more valuable than ever. Family life in the 1970s wasn't perfect, but it was anchored in presence in a way that feels rare today. When we were together, we were actually together. Meals weren't interrupted by buzzing phones or glowing screens. Conversations wandered, paused, picked back up. Sometimes they were meaningful, sometimes completely ordinary, but they happened face to face. You learned how to read expressions, how to listen, how to sit through silence without feeling the need to fill it. Arguments happened too, of course, but they had a beginning and an end. They weren't dragged out through messages or replayed endlessly online. Once something was said and settled, it usually stayed settled. There was a sense of emotional finality that allowed families to move forward. Parents weren't experts or influencers. They were just people doing their best, relying on experience, intuition, and the advice of other adults they trusted. Parenting wasn't a performance. It was private, imperfect, and human. That privacy gave families room to be real with each other. Mistakes were handled inside the home, not broadcast or compared to anyone else's. As a child, that made you feel safe. You weren't constantly measuring your family against others. You just lived your life. Grandparents and extended family often played a larger role too. Visits weren't rare events planned months in advance. They were part of the rhythm of life. You spent time with older relatives, listened to their stories, absorbed their values without realizing it. That connection across generations grounded us. It reminded us that life had continuity, that we were part of something larger than ourselves. Today, families often feel fragmented, pulled in different directions by work, schedules, and technology. In the 1970s, there was more overlap, more shared time. Even when everyone wasn't happy, they were present. That presence mattered. It built a sense of belonging that stayed with you long after childhood ended. Discipline, too, had a different tone. It wasn't about constant monitoring or control. It was about expectations. You knew what was expected of you, and when you crossed a line, there were consequences. But those consequences were usually proportional and temporary. You weren't labeled or defined by your worst moments. You were given room to grow out of them. That approach built accountability without crushing your sense of self. Looking back now, I realize how much emotional security came from that balance. You felt guided, not watched, corrected, not judged. In today's world, where family life often competes with screens and external pressures, that kind of grounded connection feels harder to maintain. But in the 1970s, it was simply how things were. Families weren't perfect, but they were present. And that presence created a foundation of safety, identity, and belonging that many of us still carry, quietly, through our lives. Looking back now, one of the most striking differences between growing up in the 1970s and growing up today is how slowly we were allowed to become ourselves. There was no pressure to define your identity early, no constant questions about who you were going to be, what you were going to do, or how you were supposed to feel about everything. Childhood and adolescence unfolded gradually. You tried things, dropped them, picked up new interests, changed your mind, and no one felt the need to document or judge every phase. You were allowed to be unfinished. In the 1970s, mistakes didn't follow you forever. There was no digital trail preserving every awkward moment, every bad decision, every phase you'd rather forget. When something embarrassing happened, it lived in memory, not in a database. Over time, it faded, softened, or turned into a story you laughed about. That impermanence gave us courage. We took risks socially, emotionally, creatively, because the cost of failure was low. Today, failure feels heavier. It's recorded, shared, and sometimes weaponized. That changes how people behave. Back then, you could experiment with who you were without fear of permanent consequences. That freedom shaped confidence in a quiet, lasting way. Social life followed the same pattern. Friendships formed through proximity and shared experience, not algorithms. You became close to the people you saw every day, the ones you walked to school with, played with, argued with, and made up with. Conflict wasn't something you avoided. It was something you worked through, face to face. You learned how to read tone, body language, silence. Those skills stayed with you. Today, so much communication happens through screens, stripped of nuance, easily misunderstood. In the 1970s, relationships were messier but deeper. You couldn't mute someone. You had to deal with them. And in doing so, You learned empathy, patience, and resilience. Even identity itself felt less fragile. Without constant comparison to curated images and opinions, you measured yourself against your own experience, not against an endless feed of other lives. That made self-worth steadier, less dependent on external validation. I think that's why so many of us from that era carry a quiet confidence, even if we don't talk about it much. It was built slowly, through real interactions, real challenges, real time. When I watch younger generations now, I don't envy the pressure they live under. The world asks them to define themselves quickly, publicly, and permanently. In the 1970s, the world was patient with us. It gave us space to grow into ourselves at our own pace. And that patience, that allowance for imperfection and change, may be one of the greatest gifts we didn't realize we were receiving at the time. As I've grown older, I've come to realize that growing up without phones didn't just change how we spent our time. It changed how we experienced reality itself. In the 1970s, moments were complete. When you were somewhere, you were fully there. You didn't divide your attention between the present and a screen in your hand. If you went to a baseball game, you watched the game. If you sat with a friend, you looked at their face, listened to their voice, noticed their pauses. Memory worked differently then. Because moments weren't constantly interrupted or documented, they settled deeper. They became stories you carried inside you, not files you stored somewhere else. Today, people often experience life through a lens, thinking about how something will look or be shared, instead of how it feels. Back then, there was no incentive to perform your life. You lived it. That made joy quieter but richer. It also made sadness more private, more manageable. You processed emotions internally, or with the people closest to you, not in front of an invisible audience. That privacy protected us. It allowed healing to happen without pressure. Another thing phones changed is how we dealt with loneliness. In the 1970s, being alone didn't mean being cut off. You were still connected to the world through routine, through place, through familiarity. You recognized people in town. You belonged somewhere. Today you can be constantly connected and deeply lonely at the same time. That paradox didn't exist back then. Silence wasn't something to fear. It was something to inhabit. We learned how to sit with ourselves, how to think, how to daydream. Those skills don't develop automatically. They require space. In the absence of constant input, our inner lives grew. I believe that's why so many people from my generation still value quiet, still seek moments of stillness even now. It feels like home. Technology has given us incredible tools, no doubt about that. But it has also fragmented attention, shortened patience, and blurred the boundary between public and private life. In the 1970s, that boundary was clear. Home was home. School was school. Outside was outside. Each space had its own rules and rhythms. Today, everything overlaps. Work enters the home. News enters the bedroom. Stress follows you everywhere. As a child, I didn't know how protected I was by those boundaries. I just knew that when I closed my bedroom door at night, the world stayed on the other side. That sense of separation gave my mind rest. It allowed dreams, imagination, and reflection to flourish. Looking back now, I see how deeply that shaped who I became. Growing up without phones wasn't about deprivation. It was about presence. And presence, I've learned, is one of the most valuable things a human being can have. Trust is a word that comes to mind often when I think about 1970s America, especially the kind of trust that flowed quietly between people without needing to be announced. Neighbors trusted each other. Parents trusted the community. Children trusted that the world, while not perfect, was generally safe enough to explore. That trust didn't come from ignorance alone. It came from familiarity. People knew each other. They recognized faces, routines, patterns. You belonged to a place, and that place knew you. If something felt wrong, it stood out. Today, life feels more anonymous. We move through spaces filled with strangers, guided by systems instead of relationships. In the 1970s, relationships were the system. Trust also extended to institutions in a way that feels foreign now. Teachers, coaches, shop owners, neighbors, their authority wasn't constantly questioned or reviewed. That doesn't mean they were always right, but it meant social life had a certain stability. You knew where you stood. That clarity reduced anxiety. Children weren't constantly negotiating rules or expectations. They absorbed them through experience. If you broke a rule, the response was usually immediate and human. A look, a word, a consequence. Then it was over. That simplicity allowed trust to reset quickly. I think about how much effort goes into creating safety today through technology, monitoring, and control. And yet, so many people feel less safe. In the 1970s, safety emerged from connection, not surveillance. You weren't protected by cameras or apps. You were protected by people who noticed when something was off. That kind of protection feels warmer, more humane. It allowed for mistakes without fear of being permanently marked. Trust also shaped how we saw ourselves. When adults trusted us, we learned to trust our own judgment. We made decisions, experienced the outcomes, and adjusted. That feedback loop built confidence. Today, when every decision is guided, tracked, or corrected in advance, that loop weakens. People grow up less certain of themselves, more dependent on external validation. In the 1970s, validation came from competence, from doing something and realizing you could. Fixing a bike, navigating across town, handling a problem on your own. Those small victories accumulated into a sense of self-worth that didn't need constant reinforcement. As I look around now, I see a culture that struggles with trust at every level. Trust in others, trust in systems, trust in oneself. It's not something you can rebuild overnight. It's cultivated slowly, through repeated experiences of reliability and care. Growing up in the 1970s gave many of us those experiences early, and they stayed with us. Even now, when the world feels uncertain, that foundation still holds. It reminds us that trust, once learned deeply, doesn't disappear. When I think about freedom in the 1970s, I don't picture anything dramatic. I picture ordinary days that belonged to us. Freedom wasn't about doing whatever you wanted without limits. It was about having room to breathe inside those limits. You knew the boundaries, and within them, life was wide open. That kind of freedom taught responsibility naturally. When you managed your own time, even in small ways, you learned its value. When you chose how to spend an afternoon, you felt the weight of that choice, even if you couldn't name it yet. Today, so much freedom is simulated. It happens within platforms designed to keep you engaged, guided by algorithms that decide what you see and when. In the 1970s, freedom was physical. It involved movement, exploration, getting lost and finding your way back. It lived in your body, not on a screen. That physical freedom shaped our sense of scale. We understood distance, effort, limits. We knew how long it took to walk somewhere, how tired we'd feel after biking across town. That knowledge grounded us in reality. Now, so much happens instantly, without effort, without distance. Convenience has replaced experience in many ways. Freedom also meant privacy. You could disappear for a while without explanation. No one expected immediate access to you. That absence wasn't suspicious, it was normal. It gave you space to think, to feel, to exist without being observed. Today, absence often raises concern. Not responding quickly is seen as a problem. In the 1970s, being unreachable was part of life. And in that unreachability, we learned how to rely on ourselves. I remember long walks alone, thinking about nothing in particular, letting my mind wander. Those moments shaped me more than I realized. They built an inner life that didn't depend on constant input. As an adult, I still return to that habit when I can. It feels like reconnecting with an older, steadier version of myself. Freedom in the 1970s also came with trust in the future. We weren't constantly told that time was running out, or that everything was falling apart. The future felt open, not urgent. That openness allowed hope to exist without pressure. Today, the future often feels heavy, crowded with warnings and deadlines. Back then, it felt like a horizon you'd reach when you were ready. Looking back now, I see how that sense of freedom shaped not just our childhoods, but our outlook on life. It taught us to move at our own pace, to trust ourselves, to value time as something to be experienced, not optimized. That lesson feels increasingly rare and increasingly precious. Aging gives you a strange perspective on time. You start to see patterns, cycles, things that repeat even as the world changes its surface. When I look back at the 1970s now, I don't just see nostalgia. I see a set of values quietly shaping everyday life. Patience, presence, community. None of these were taught as lessons. They were absorbed through routine, through the way days unfolded without urgency, through the way people interacted without intermediaries. In the 1970s, life wasn't optimized, it was lived. Today, so much energy goes into efficiency, productivity, and speed. Back then, slowness wasn't a flaw, it was the default. And in that slowness, people noticed each other. They talked. They listened. They waited their turn. Those small acts built social fabric. You felt part of something, even if you couldn't articulate what that something was. As an older man now, I miss that fabric. Not because the past was better in every way, but because it offered something we're struggling to recreate. I see people today searching for connection through technology, trying to replace what used to happen naturally. In the 1970s, connection didn't require effort. It required presence. You showed up. You stayed. You paid attention. That was enough. There was also a different relationship with time itself. Days felt longer, not because they were filled with more, but because they were filled with less. Fewer interruptions, fewer choices, fewer demands on attention that allowed moments to stretch, to breathe. Today, even full days can feel empty, because they pass in a blur of tasks and screens. Back then, a simple afternoon could feel complete. I think about how that shaped our emotional memory. We remember feelings more than events. The feeling of a warm evening, the sound of cicadas, the weight of silence after a long day. Those sensations anchor memories in the body. They don't fade easily. As time passes, those memories become touchstones, reminders of who we were and what mattered. In a fast-moving world, those touchstones provide stability. They remind us that a good life doesn't require constant novelty, it requires depth. Looking back now, I see the 1970s, not as a golden age, but as a human-scaled one. Life fit the limits of attention, emotion, and community. Today, we're constantly pushing beyond those limits, and it shows. Stress, anxiety, fragmentation, these aren't personal failures. They're symptoms of a world that has forgotten how to slow down. Remembering the 1970s, for me, isn't about escaping the present. It's about carrying forward the parts of the past that still serve us. The patience, the presence, the quiet confidence that comes from living in a world that doesn't demand everything all at once. Sometimes people ask me if I wish we could go back, if I'd trade the world we have now for the one I grew up in. I always pause before answering, because it's not that simple. The 1970s weren't perfect, and the world today has brought real progress, real comfort, real opportunities. But what I do wish is that we hadn't lost so much along the way. Growing up without fear or phones wasn't about rejecting the future. It was about being rooted in the present. That rootedness gave us stability. It gave us a sense of proportion. Problems felt solvable. Life felt manageable. Today, everything feels bigger, louder, more urgent. The volume never turns down. In the 1970s, silence was part of the soundtrack of life. You didn't need to escape it. You lived inside it. And that silence gave meaning to sound, to conversation, to laughter. I think about children now and the weight they carry, the information they're exposed to before they're ready. We were protected by ignorance in the best possible way. Not ignorance of values or responsibility, but ignorance of constant crisis. We were allowed to grow into awareness gradually. That gradualness mattered. It made the world less overwhelming. It gave joy room to exist without competition. As an adult now, I try to recreate pieces of that life where I can. I leave my phone behind on walks. I sit without background noise. I let boredom return, just to see what happens. And something always does. Memories surface. Ideas form. A sense of calm settles in. It reminds me that the way we lived in the 1970s isn't gone forever. It's still accessible, if we choose it. It lives in habits, in boundaries, in the decision to be present. We can't turn back time, but we can carry forward what worked. We can teach younger generations that attention is valuable, that silence isn't empty, that fear doesn't need to run the show. The world will always have challenges. That hasn't changed. What has changed is how closely we hold them. In the 1970s, challenges existed at a distance. Today, they sit in our pockets. Remembering how it felt to grow up without that constant proximity to fear helps me keep perspective. It reminds me that life is bigger than the news cycle, deeper than the latest alert. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Not that the past was better, but that it still has something important to teach us about how to live well now. As the years pass, I've noticed that the people who grew up in the 1970s carry a certain quiet steadiness with them. It's not something loud or boastful. You can see it in how they handle uncertainty, how they approach problems, how they sit comfortably in a room without needing to fill every moment. That steadiness wasn't taught in a classroom. It was formed in long afternoons without plans, in conversations that weren't rushed, in challenges we faced without immediate rescue. Growing up without phones forced us to develop internal resources. We learned how to soothe ourselves, how to think things through, how to wait. Those skills don't disappear with age. They become anchors. When life gets complicated, when the world feels overwhelming, that inner calm resurfaces. I see it in myself now more than ever. When things slow down, I don't panic. I settle in. That response was learned early, in a time when slowness was normal. Another thing that stands out to me is how we learned to value relationships. Because communication required effort, because you couldn't reach someone instantly, time with people mattered more. You showed up when you said you would. You followed through. Your word had weight. That built trust, and trust built strong bonds. Today, communication is easy, but connection often feels fragile. Messages are sent and forgotten. Plans change at the last minute. In the 1970s, that kind of casual inconsistency was rare. It wasn't efficient, but it was reliable. Reliability builds character. It teaches you to be someone others can count on. That lesson shaped a generation. I think about how that steadiness shows up in small ways. Fixing things instead of replacing them. Listening before speaking. Taking time to decide instead of reacting immediately. These habits weren't taught explicitly. They were modeled by adults who lived the same way. Life moved at a pace that allowed values to sink in. Today, values are often discussed, debated, posted, and shared. Back then, they were lived, quietly, consistently, and because of that, they lasted. As I grow older, I find myself grateful for that upbringing more and more. It gave me a foundation that doesn't shake easily, even when the world does. It taught me that not everything needs to be fast, loud, or visible to matter. Some of the most important things in life happen slowly, in the background, without an audience. Growing up in 1970s America prepared us for a life that would change faster than anyone expected. And even now, in a world that feels unrecognizable at times, that preparation still holds. As I reach the later chapters of my life, memory takes on a different weight. It's no longer just something you look back on for comfort. It becomes a guide. When the present feels noisy or uncertain, memory reminds you of what truly matters. For me, the memories of growing up in 1970s America do that work quietly but consistently. They remind me that a good life doesn't require constant stimulation or approval. It requires meaning, connection, and enough space to breathe. I see younger people today struggling with questions we rarely faced so early. Who am I supposed to be? Am I doing enough? Am I falling behind? Those questions exist in every generation, but they arrive much sooner now, amplified by comparison and constant exposure. In the 1970s, those questions came later, when you had more life behind you to answer them. Childhood was protected from that pressure. That protection mattered. It allowed confidence to form naturally, based on experience rather than image. As an older man, I feel a responsibility to share these memories, not to criticize the present, but to offer perspective. The world didn't always feel this rushed, this tense, this demanding, and it doesn't have to feel that way all the time now. The past shows us that there are other ways to live, other rhythms that support human well-being. We can choose them, even in small ways, choosing to be present, choosing to listen, choosing to let a moment unfold without interruption. These aren't outdated habits, they're human ones. Growing up without phones taught us that attention is finite and precious. You don't give it away lightly. You invest it where it matters. That lesson becomes more important with age, not less. Time feels different when you've lived a lot of it. You become selective. You focus on depth instead of breadth. In that sense, the way we grew up in the 1970s prepared us well for aging. We know how to slow down without feeling lost. We know how to be alone without feeling lonely. We know how to find meaning in simple things. Those skills don't come from technology. They come from experience. From days spent outside, conversations held face to face, moments allowed to breathe. As I look ahead, I carry those lessons with me. They steady me. They remind me that even as the world changes, human needs remain the same. Connection, trust, presence. These are timeless, and they're worth protecting, no matter the decade. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this story, it's the understanding that what we remember about the 1970s isn't just nostalgia for a different time. It's recognition of a different way of being human. Growing up without fear or phones shaped us in ways we didn't notice until much later, when the world had changed enough for the contrast to become clear. We learned how to live inside our lives, not alongside them. We learned that attention is an act of care, that time is something you inhabit, not something you manage. Those lessons don't expire. They wait patiently for us to remember them. When I think about my childhood now, I don't focus on specific dates or events. I focus on how it felt to move through the world without constant urgency, to trust that tomorrow would come without needing to be chased. That feeling still matters. It still offers something valuable in a time when so many people feel overwhelmed, distracted, and disconnected. The past can't be recreated, but it can be honored. And honoring it doesn't mean rejecting the present. It means choosing what to carry forward. We can choose to protect quiet moments. We can choose to be fully present with the people we love. We can choose to step away from fear when it isn't serving us. These choices are small, but they add up. They shape days, and days shape lives. As someone who lived through that earlier time, I feel grateful, not because it was perfect, but because it gave me a foundation that still holds. It taught me that life doesn't need to be loud to be meaningful, that connection doesn't need to be constant to be real, and that fear loses its power when it isn't invited to run everything. If you remember those days too, I hope this brought something warm back to you. And if you didn't live through them, I hope this gave you a glimpse of what was possible, and what still is. Because at its core, this story isn't about the 1970s. It's about what happens when people are trusted, when time is allowed to move naturally, and when childhood is given the freedom to be just that, childhood, and that, no matter the era, is something worth preserving.